This week in our People of God studies, we're going to look at a man named Peter. So Peter was one of Jesus' disciples, and he's known as someone who has had really high highs and really low lows. He was one of Jesus' closest three, and so he followed Jesus and his ministry really close. But before he became a disciple, he was known as a man named Peter, and he was a fisherman. So he spent most of his time out at sea, oftentimes not having a lot of luck. But one time, he was out on the boat with two guys named James and John, who also later became some of Jesus' disciples. And so they were out in the sea and not catching much, and they ended up finding Jesus, and Jesus tells them to come follow him, and he will make them fishers of men. And so from this point on, we see him struggle to follow Jesus, but also with eagerness and boldness. One of these times we see Peter have a really high in ministry is when he steps out in boldness and ends up walking on water. But we also see him having a really low where he denies Jesus 3 times and who he is. Throughout all of this, we see Peter follow Jesus closely and remain one of Jesus' closest disciples. Throughout all of this ups and downs, Jesus still remains faithful to him and brings him along to teach him. What I want to look at, while there's many examples to look at who Peter is and things that he did well and things that Jesus taught him, I want to look at John 21. And so for a little context of John 21 this is after Jesus has been crucified and he was resurrected. And at this point, he's already appeared to a few people. But what's happening in 21 is Peter again is out fishing with a few of the disciples, and it's overnight, and so around morning time, there's a man at the shore that yells out to them and asks if they're catching any fish. They reply and say no, and before long they realize that this man is Jesus who has been resurrected. And so Peter jumps out of the boat and swims back, and Jesus has basically like a breakfast ready for them. He has some bread and tells them to bring in some fish. And so they eat together, and Peter and Jesus have a conversation. Jesus says to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus then again replies and said, feed my lambs. This happens again, and Jesus asks, he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter then again replies and says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he tells him again, tend my sheep. A third time, he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And at this point, Peter's getting the point, because he sees that this is a reminder of the time that he denied Jesus 3 times. And so again, he replies, Lord, you know everything, you know that I love you. So he acknowledges that Jesus knows everything, but replies with, yes, of course I love you. And Jesus again says, feed my sheep. What's cool about this is Jesus doesn't only reply and say, feed my sheep, but he continues. He restores Peter and calls him to more, and calls him to follow him again. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This is said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. And so we see here Peter and Jesus having a conversation that's really restorative, because before this, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus and him are having a conversation. But what's interesting is when you look at this, Jesus wasn't asking Peter to apologize and say all these things he did wrong. Instead, Jesus reminds him of his love and calls him again to obedience. And it's a really good example to look at, because I think a lot of us can relate to Peter. We oftentimes don't have it together, and we continue to mess up. Yet, God shows us in this how he reminded Peter of the love he has and still calls us to obedience. After this interaction with Jesus, we see Peter become on fire for Jesus and was a huge force just for ministry and his kingdom. And like I said earlier, he was known as one of the pillars of the church. And so throughout the life of Peter and all these ups and downs, we see the worthiness of Christ and Christ's faithfulness to redeem. We also see that Jesus sees us how he intends us to be. And what I mean by that is, at the beginning, before Peter became a disciple of Jesus, he was known as a man named Simon. And Jesus was actually the one to give him this name, Peter. And in Greek, that word means rock. And so we see that Jesus intended Peter to be a firm foundation, to be a rock of faith. And while we see Peter have many ups and downs and doesn't always fulfill that, and we see him sometimes as a reckless fisherman who denies Jesus, we see how Jesus brings a good work that he started in Peter come to completion when he restores him after all these events and all of these ups and downs, where Peter still continues to mess up, but God restores him in his faithfulness and in his grace and continues to use Peter for his kingdom.